Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. I'm Tom Schwartz, the director, and I'm pleased to open this important conference examining the many humanitarian efforts created in response to World War I. As many of you know, Herbert Hoover's moniker, the Great Humanitarian, had its origins in his efforts to help stranded Americans safely return home at the outbreak of the war, as well as his creation for the Commission for Relief in Belgium that provided food for millions of non-combatants in German-occupied Belgium and northern France. I hope you take time during your visit here today to explore the temporary exhibit, The Making of the Great Humanitarian, Herbert Hoover in World War I, as well as walk to the Belgian village just outside the museum to learn more about this significant historical event. I'd like to recognize the vital support for this program and all our programs by the Hoover Presidential Foundation. They make all of these conferences and temporary exhibits possible. If you are not a member, I hope you will pick up a membership brochure, which is on the table just outside the auditorium, and consider adding your support. I also want to thank C-SPAN for being here today, making this conference available to a wider audience. And I would be remiss for not reminding everyone to silence all of your electronic devices now, as a courtesy for the speakers and other members of the audience. At this time, I would like to introduce Matthew Schaefer, archivist at the Hoover Library Museum. Matt is the organizer of this event, having assisted all the panelists in their various research projects that are reflected in today's conference. I'm constantly amazed at Matt's encyclopedic knowledge of the manuscript collections and his unfailing enthusiasm for assisting researchers in advancing our understanding of Herbert Hoover and his times. Here to introduce our speakers is Matt Schaefer.
Thank you, Tom. It is my very great pleasure to introduce the speakers today who will present. I've known them all for quite some time. Now, at my age, quite some time means some indefinite number of years between 5 and 10. I met each as they came to the Hoover Library to do research on varied aspects of the Commission for Relief of Belgium. And now, I'm thrilled to introduce them and give them a chance to share what they've learned with you. I sometimes lead tours in the galleries here. I led one this morning. When I get to the World War I era and talk about the CRB, I speak of Hoover feeding millions, Hoover organizing, Hoover, Hoover, Hoover. And perhaps understandably, it's the Hoover Presidential Library. But even as I'm giving this speech, I realize I'm doing a disservice to the hundreds of Americans and thousands of Europeans who formed the boots on the ground, if you will, for the Commission of Relief of Belgium. These four folks have studied, each of those people have a story, thousands of stories. And these four have made a study of that, and they're going to share them with you today. Our final speaker, batting cleanup, playing center field, Tammy Proctor, who again came to the Hoover Library some time ago to do research on civilians in World War I. Over the next few years, Tammy's path and mine and my wife's kept crossing. She returned to do research at the Hoover Library on a foundation grant. My wife and I spoke at her college, Wittenberg, on, archives and the shaping of history, a grand tour topic that we thoroughly enjoyed. We kept running into each other at conferences. And since we've met, Tammy's written 4 books, which is 3 more than I've read in those 10 years. She has written Women in Espionage in World War I, in the First World War, Civilians in a World at War, Scouting for Girls, a centennial history of Girl Guides and Scouts, and On My Honor. I have short attention span. I read articles, and I read her article, a recent article on the destruction and rebuilding of Louvain Library in Belgium after World War I and between the wars, and I thought I knew this topic well. And I came away with 3 new ideas, and again, hats off to teaching me something that I did not know about a topic I thought I knew well.
And I'm on, good. Well, again, thanks to Matt for organizing this. It's a pleasure to come back here. I've been coming for about 10 years now, I think, off and on, and I should confess that I'm a European historian, so I fit a little uneasily with the others in the group. I'm the imposter. But I got interested in the CRB when I was doing a book on Belgian women who worked for British intelligence as spies, basically. And there were all these interesting Belgian intelligence networks that were operating, along with underground newspapers and some of the stuff Jeff talks about in his book. And I picked up Hugh Gibson's book. He was the secretary of the American legation in Brussels, because I wanted to see what he had to say about some of the women that I was looking at. And I ran across the story of the CRB while I was reading his book. And so I kind of filed it away and decided, all right, I'm going to go check that out. And then, 10 years later, I'm still collecting material on this and working on it. So in the autumn of 1915, a small crime wave began in Leuven in Belgium. Today it's Leuven in Flemish part of Belgium, which continued till the end of the war. German occupying authorities arrested several dozen people and sentenced them to short prison stays, 3 to 8 days typically, for the crime of potato smuggling. Men, women, children, young and old, rich and poor, the Belgian population of the city of Leuven conceived of a number of plans for obtaining and transporting potatoes in order to feed their families. They also smuggled other things like butter, but potatoes were the most common things to be smuggled. A typical condemnation for this kind of behavior, and these are some of the posters that said you are absolutely forbidden not to carry potatoes, in other parts of the Belgian territory that showed up during the war. But anyway, a typical condemnation reads as thus. LJ, a woman of 30 years old, was sentenced to 2 days in prison for non-authorized transport of potatoes destined for her family's usage. In such a world, where possessing a small quantity of potatoes, and in her case, it's a very, very small amount. It's like a bag of potatoes, and she ends up in prison for 2 days. But in this kind of a world, where you have a forbidden item and it could land you in prison, food really dominated daily life. Whether Belgians were resisting the occupying authorities, or scrounging for food for their families, or spending hours working for the alimentation, the food efforts, life revolved around food, and it really does show up in diaries. Every entry practically mentions food. So in my short time with you, I'd like to just illustrate the role that ordinary Belgians played in the work that Hoover and his men supervised. The thousands of people who made the food distribution possible are not all that visible in the historic record, but I'd like you to think about the nitty-gritty details of what it would take to feed millions of people on a daily basis. And to do so, I thought maybe I would use the town of Leuven, which is a medium-sized town, a medium-sized town that became a symbol of the war when much of the town was burned by the Germans in 1914. So as background for this, let me just talk a little bit about the burning. On the evening of the 25th of August, 1914, the city of Leuven, which had a population of around 40,000, witnessed serious destruction at the hands of the German invasion force. Spurred by rumors of mythical civilian snipers, there were fears among German soldiers that Belgians were going to be shooting at them from the windows as they marched into town. German soldiers panicked and ravaged the town. By the 28th of August, so this is during the invasion, more than 200 civilians were dead, nearly 1,100 buildings had been torched, and the university library, which was a kind of cultural icon in Belgium, was a hollow, burned-out shell. And you can see this is the main hall of the library. In the case of the latter, lurid accounts later described how German soldiers deliberately set fire to the library, further fueling anger over senseless destruction. This was very much a part of the propaganda that was directed to the British and to the neutral Americans at the time. Leuven's entire collection was lost, with only a few charred remnants and scarred sculptures remaining. And so Leuven became central to the Allied narrative about German war atrocities, the idea that Germans were not cultured, that they didn't believe in civilization. And you can see some examples here. These are both of Leuven. Belgium itself became a kind of helpless female victim in much of this propaganda, kind of like a damsel in distress, and Brandon showed one earlier too, with the German soldier dragging the young girl off, and that often is how Belgium is shown. Underneath all this rhetoric of cultural atrocity that was going out to the rest of the world, however, the people living in Leuven had a more serious problem. Shelter, food. They had no gas, no electricity. They had 1,100 buildings burned or destroyed. There were homeless families seeking assistance. There was very little food moving because it was an active war area. Lack of water. I mean, you can imagine what this is like in September. Also, many of the fields around the town had been destroyed during the invasion, so the things that they might have used to help, bring in food to the town weren't available. So long before Americans brought food to the region, Belgian local committees organized trying to get their resources together. As early as the first week in September of 1914, Belgian bankers and business people met in Brussels to create a central committee. This was under the leadership of Emile Franke, which Jeff mentioned earlier. Under this broad umbrella, which was eventually known as the Comité National, the Belgians across the country put together regional and local committees. So it's kind of a very complicated hierarchy of organizations in Belgium. Altogether, about 10 million Belgian and French civilians received aid in the form of food and clothing and other services. While I certainly don't want to downplay Hoover's role in running this vast logistical organization or the part of the delegates, which we've heard a lot about, I do want to say that there's no way that the CRB could have done this without the 60,000 Belgians who actually did the work of handing bowls of soup to children or sorting clothing. I don't know if any of you have ever volunteered at Goodwill, but imagine sorting donated clothing and trying to find things that are useful. So there's a lot of work involved in the nitty-gritty details of this organization. Also, I should mention that because of the restrictions on travel in Belgium, it was difficult to move around the country. There was also multiple languages at work. Even today, Belgium has 3 official languages. There were a lot of dialects at the time. It really became important to work with local committees because they needed to know the local environment. And people couldn't just, or Belgian people anyway, couldn't just move from one end of the country to the other. The Americans could do that. They had special permits, but the Belgians couldn't. So they really worked locally. Leuven functioned as a center for the Brabant Provincial Committee, and the headquarters for the region was located, kind of funny that this is the name of it, at the American College at Leuven, which had been formed hundreds of years before, but that's just one of the buildings that they were able to use. So this is the entrance to the American College. To give a sense of the scope of the work, the region had 339 local committees and a total population of more than 700,000 people. This is one region. And here's a map to kind of give you a sense. So this is the province of Brabant. Brussels actually had its own organization, so it's the little island in the middle of the map there. The work was overseen by a local landowner and by a university professor. The 2 of them functioned to run the committee. Altogether, just in this province, about 10,000 people worked for the Comité Provincial in Brabant, and that includes some paid personnel, but mostly volunteers. Because of the wartime emergency and the occupation, local authorities were in effect creating a whole new economy. And I think we got a sense of that from the 3 earlier presentations. But nothing was normal, so it was a matter of really trying to start from scratch and figure out how to make things work as normally as possible. One of the things that they had to figure out was what to do about money. And so you see very early in the war the creation of this kind of temporary scrip. They called them bons. And this is a good example from Leuven down here. Let me use my pointer. This one, as you can see, it's a handwritten, almost like an IOU, that was produced in September of 1914. So they were pretty rudimentary at the beginning. as time advanced, they got better. You can see some over here. And then eventually, actually, printers in Belgium started making these, and they look much more like banknotes later on. So, you know, that's just an example of some of the things they had to create. The other thing they had to figure out is who needed food and who had food. So initially in the fall of 1914, there was a mass census. And Belgian volunteers went out and asked people, how much food do you have? Not everyone reported what they had, which I know will surprise you. They were trying to find out if food was being hoarded. And they also did a census of all the farmers to find out who might have crops that they could use. So this census was really important, and it helped them supplement what food that they were going to get later from outside the country. Once they had all this figured out, they gave ration cards to the heads of households in Leuven. Families could choose two options, either flour or bread. So if they wanted to bake their own bread, they could do so. A lot of people chose to get the bread pre-baked, which is what Belgians were used to doing, but they had the option. The head of household also received a second card, which provided them with a fixed amount that they could purchase at local shops. So goods at these shops, I'll give you some examples. Lard or other kinds of fat, beans, peas, cocoa, soap when it was available, that kind of stuff. The main shop in Leuven, which was located in the Rue de Tirlemont, was in 2 large halls, and it had about 30 cashiers. It was open 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. So this was a big operation. I mean, it's like running a large grocery store. And this work, which was setting up these shops and giving ration cards to the population, affected just about everyone in Belgium. We've heard a lot about the school children feeding and some of the work to help the neediest populations, but there was also just the basic, let's make sure everybody gets access to food and that there's some equity. The other thing that the Belgian committees had to take into account is all of the other social welfare tasks that come about when war happens. There are a lot of people who are targeted or who are destitute. So I want to give you a couple of examples of these. Some of them are kind of creative, and it's surprising what they were able to do in wartime. And actually, the museum has examples of some of these things that I'm going to talk about, so you'll be able to see them. One of the problems is that certain populations had certain problems. By that I mean school children were a special group, and there was a lot of interest in that, in making sure children had food. But another group, infants and toddlers, smaller children, they weren't at school. So how do you get food to that group? How do you help them? Prior to the war in Belgium, many toddlers especially were fed with either homemade or imported baby food. It's kind of the beginning of the baby food industry, and there's a new book that just came out on the history of baby food. It's really fascinating. I recommend. And supplies of this foreign product were cut off during the war. So with the support of the Comité National, they made loans to people to start these different war industries. A factory in Brussels was retooled to produce, and here's the name of the food, American Lillian baby's food. I have no idea who American Lillian was, but that was the baby food. During the war, about 1 million kilos of this baby food was consumed in just this province alone, to give you an example. Manufacturers were also worried about nursing mothers. So they created a product called Lactogen, which I have no idea what it was, but it was supposed to build up the mothers so that they could nurse infants. There's another product called Belgian Curing Food, which was for sickly infants. And for school children, the De Lacker biscuit company, which still exists today, you can still buy chocolate biscuits from De Lacker, they created a special school biscuit, basically for students. They're cookies for children. And I haven't tried yet the Hoover cookies in the shop, but I'm imagining there's something like the Scholar biscuit, so we'll see. They even created, which tells you that Belgium wasn't as bad off in some ways as some countries like Poland during the war. They had dog biscuits also that were produced. So at least early in the war they were able to keep pets, which by the end of the war was less common. Another manufacturing product that was developed in the middle of the war to deal with shortages was, I would say universally hated probably. This is a substitute for coffee. And Jeff mentioned the coffee shipment that Edward Bunge was able to get at the beginning of the war, but it didn't last very long. And coffee was a real staple in the Belgian diet. And so eventually they decided that maybe they could make a kind of a coffee out of roasted grain. Yeah, and it's called Tourmaline, and it was a coffee substitute. And one of the main factories for producing this was in Louvain, and it employed 40 people. These are 40 people who then were able to get employment cards when the deportations came, so if you can kind of see the links here between our presentations. As the official history of the Comité in Brabant sort of wryly notes, I'll quote, "Until the end of 1916, the demand for Tourmaline was quite moderate. The shops still had a little coffee, but mostly the public expressed a real defiance, or one could say an aversion, to this ground powder, the color of dirt." And so I found this kind of hilarious slide actually. This is a brass teapot talking to a coffee mill, you can see. And the subject is actually the fact that the Germans are requisitioning all of the metals from households, which is something that happened in Belgium during the war. They went door to door and took metal doorknobs and kitchen items and all kinds of stuff. And the teapot's saying, I know you can't read it because it's too small, but the teapot's saying, "Aren't you worried about the requisitioning and you're going to lose your top?" And the coffee mill says, "Are you kidding? I'm paraphrasing, are you kidding? That's better than this Tourmaline that they keep putting through me." So, you know, it's kind of a funny thing here. So, ultimately people overcame their aversion because they wanted a hot drink. And as you probably know, in World War I, the third winter of the war was particularly harsh. Fuel was short. And so having a hot drink was really important. And so this is produced in great quantity. In 1918 alone, so just that year, Louvain produced almost 500,000 kilos of Tourmaline for consumption. So the problem, though, that the committee faced, not just with Tourmaline, but with a lot of products, is that people didn't actually like some of the things they were being given. And the museum points this out in its new exhibit. There's a famous Belgian aversion to cornmeal and to canned corn. When it's brought in and presented, many people say this is animal food. How could you give this to us? So they have to try to educate people about, hey, you can really eat cornmeal. It's not just for animals. But because these were key goods, I mean, think about what the United States grows and what they're willing to send. Lots of cans of corn. So they had to figure out some way to do it, and many times they have to stop them from feeding it to the animals anyway. And the other problem is that some people would never go to a soup kitchen, regardless of if they starved to death in their houses. And so the Belgians are sensitive to things like class in their midst. And so they have to create other ways of helping the so-called middle-class poor. Or what they end up calling this in English is discreet assistance. Assistance to people who are wealthy, or who have been wealthy, who are now suddenly destitute, who are too proud to go to a soup kitchen. And so they do this in the form of lots of different kinds of aid. There are volunteers who visit homes personally and take food. Sometimes they hire this class of people to work at the soup kitchens, and then they get a free meal because they're working there, but because they're dispensing aid, it helps with that issue of pride. There's countless other projects: donated clothing, boot workshops, tubercular clinics. In Brabant, the list of different kinds of social welfare programs it numbers about 36 or 37 programs. So it's quite an operation. Shops made wooden toys, papier-mâché puppets. They have subsidized meals in restaurants. Just a whole variety of things. And here's some examples. of, this is the shop where you could buy things. This is one of these subsidized restaurants where you could go out and have like a real restaurant meal, but at a cheaper rate. So to kind of provide normalcy. The other thing that becomes a real problem for the Belgians, and several others have alluded to this, is the refugee problem. And as the war progresses, refugees start pouring into some of the Belgian provinces from the war areas, especially the ones along the Belgian-French borders. And so towns that had kind of figured out how to feed people now had tens of thousands of refugees flooding in. Also, the deported workers start coming back. They don't have anything. They're undernourished. Some of them are on foot. Returned prisoners of war start showing up. And so really, by the end of the war, there's quite a lot of strain on the system. So I've only mentioned a fraction of the activities, but I hope it gives you a little bit of a window into the day-to-day activities of the work that the CRB delegates were supervising under Hoover's leadership. And I think that for the delegates who went on to work for the ARA, Belgium became the model. That's what they wanted. They thought they could expect when they went into other countries, because the Belgian social networks were quite well developed. They put together these committees. They worked well together, and they didn't find that necessarily in some of the other countries that they went to. And so they try to put the Belgian model in place. And a lot of times they'll talk about this. Maurice Pate in Poland talks about, oh, if we could just have some Belgian committees, it would be great. Because, you know, that's what they're used to. The last thing I want to mention, just to kind of conclude, is that there was an important power dynamic in all of this. Because while the Belgians are doing all of this work, and they're generally working well with the American delegates, and the delegates have a lot of respect for the Belgians, there are still tensions about who controls the purse strings, and about this kind of patronizing attitude that Tom mentioned. Many times the CRB delegates talk about the Belgians as their children, even adults they talk about as their children. And there's this kind of giver and receiver relationship that's an easy one. Tracy Kittredge, in his unpublished official history, notes that each delegate at that time was, in a way, the lord of his own province. So there really is this sense that the Americans are kind of standing above it all. The Americans, of course, are billeted in chateaux. They're being given rich food. They're treated like royalty. They're getting thank you gifts. You can see those in the museum. And so it's kind of heady, this work that they're doing. Historian Bruno Cambanes identifies this idealism and sense of superiority that kind of develops as the power to feed, which I think is a great line. And so often the CRB delegates have to be reminded, you know, look, the Belgians are doing a lot of work. You need to show some appreciation. You need to work with them. And at one point, Hoover, who does not always get along very well with Emile Franke, and you can read about this in any of the biographies of Hoover that you want to, he's taken to task by a British sort of diplomatic intervention. Lord Eustace Percy writes to Hoover and tries to explain this. Quote, "But at the same time you've got to face, and I have no hesitation in personally appealing to you, the fact that your position, which has been anomalous from the beginning, must in a measure become more and more anomalous as time goes by. You came in to rescue the Belgian people at a time of apparent absolute collapse. Now we have to negotiate, compromise, respect feelings with which we do not agree, or which we even consider as absurd, and put up with a great deal of that class of seeming ingratitude. I ask you with all confidence to make greater sacrifices than ever in order that you may not be drawn into the greatest sacrifice of all, namely the sacrifice of your position as the advance guard and the symbol of the sense of responsibility of the American people toward Europe." So Percy tries to tell Hoover, you know, you're damaging America's reputation if you don't give a little to the Belgian elites in particular. And it's true that by the middle of the war, the Belgians have a pretty smooth running organization. When America joins the war in 1917, the American delegates have to leave. And the Belgians really take over a lot of the work. They have Spanish and Dutch neutrals also supervising, but it's a much less hands-on role than what the Americans had. And so the Belgians can kind of function, without all of the supervision. So to conclude, I hope I've demonstrated that the partnership was vital to the functioning of the food aid program. The outpouring of gratitude from Belgians during and after the war, as evidenced by letters, decorated flour sacks, gifts, and awards, was genuine, and Hoover became a beloved figure in post-World War Belgium. This is actually the Leuven Library, which was rebuilt with American money. There's a bust to Hoover inside, and it's on the Herbert Hoover plane. And this is another Hoover sign. There are a lot of Hoover street signs in Europe. There aren't any memorials to the countless Belgian volunteers, nor to the U.S. delegates who did the grunt work. But I think in this centennial year, it's really important to remember the work that they did. Thank you.